is my honor and privilege once again to introduce Professor Stuart Hameroff. Sir is an American anesthesiologist and a professor at the University of Arizona, known for his studies of consciousness and his contention that consciousness originates from the quantum states in the neural microtubules. He's the lead organizer of the Science of Consciousness conferences. We welcome you, sir, to present your very, very invigorating talk on inward hierarchies of consciousness in Vedanta and quantum biology.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for being here. As I said earlier, it's a great honor and a privilege to be here. So I've studied consciousness from a scientific standpoint, and I'll tell you the take-home message is that something you already know, that consciousness is connected to the universe at a very fundamental level. So what we see here in the slide is we take it for granted that when we open our eyes, the world out there appears inside our head. So the world out there appears inside our head, being. The world out there appears inside our head, and I use the word being to denote conscious experience. And it's not an explanation, it's just a marker to tell you that what I intend is consciousness. So the world out there appears inside our head, being. And the way this is studied scientifically, starting from the top, is neuroscientists who probe the brain, moving clockwise, artificial intelligence, roboticists, artists who capture the essence of reality, physicists who study reality, including Schrodinger's cat, which we'll talk about, psychiatrists who probe the inner mind, anesthesiologists like me who study how anesthesia works, Eastern philosophers who meditate and look inward, and Western philosophers. And we'll start with Western philosophers like Plato, and modern neuroscientists who said the world out there is all in our head. So being is actually a representation of the outer world head. Consciousness pervades a deeper level of reality. Being. So being is everywhere. We are in an ocean, a sea of consciousness, like we are a wave in a vast sea of consciousness. But that raises the question, what is reality? Reality seems divided into two worlds with different physical laws, the quantum world and the classical world. So I've used the yin-yang here to divide the two worlds. In the quantum world, we have quantum superposition. Things can be in multiple states or locations at the same time. Things are non-local. They can be connected over great distances, wave-like and generally small. In the classical world that we're familiar with, things are localized in one place. We can see things in one place in one state at a time, tend to be particle-like and large. So consciousness actually, I think, occurs on the edge between the quantum and classical world. So in quantum superposition, a particle, for example, this atom in the yellow you see in the front, can also exist as a wave of multiple possibilities that we see in the back. So it can be a particle in the front or as a wave of multiple possibilities in the back. But we only see particles. We don't see them as waves. Upon measurement or conscious observation, it seems quantum possibilities reduce or collapse to definite states. This is called quantum state reduction or collapse of the wave function. I suggest this might also be analogous to Atman from Brahman, where we have multiple seed of consciousness and an individual self or ego emerges from that. Are the many faces of Krishna a quantum superposition, in which most people see only one? So how can particles or Krishna actually exist in multiple states and or locations? So Roger Penrose, shown here, who won the Nobel Prize in 2020 for black holes and also works in consciousness, he accounted for superposition for multiple possibilities through Einstein's theory of general relativity, which describes the basic level of the universe. Einstein's general relativity has linked mass and gravity to curvature in fundamental space-time geometry. So you can see these planets or stars, and around them you see space-time geometry, which is curved. And Einstein said that these are basically equivalent, also gravity. So gravity can be seen as curvature in space-time, and you're going to follow the curvature, and that accounts for gravity and mass. Einstein predicted the gravity of the sun's mass would curve spacetime so that a star behind the sun would be visible on Earth during an eclipse. In 1919, Sir Arthur Eddington performed this experiment and proved Einstein to be correct. He went to the top of a mountain during an eclipse, so the sun wouldn't blot it out, and he saw a star that was known to be behind the sun. He could actually see it through his telescopes. So here we see Einstein and Eddington celebrating. Einstein already had a Nobel Prize, and Eddington won it won his own for doing the experiment. So what is it that's curving? What is fundamental spacetime? What is the universe made of at its most basic level? As you go down and down, much below the level of particles. You eventually get to the Planck scale. Seems to be the basic, the basement of the universe at 10 to the minus 35 meters. So you're way, way smaller than any particles. This has been described as Godhead, the Akashic record in Eastern philosophy, maybe Brahman, also the plenum in ancient Greece, and scientifically, space-time manifold, the metric, geometry, and quantum gravity. And Penrose came up with several explanations, including spin networks and twistors that we see in the upper right. Now, if you see in the middle of that two-dimensional space-time sheet, that's a useful way of showing space-time. So what about space-time curvature at small scales? He showed this for large scales, but what about tiny scales? Next, Roger equated quantum particles with tiny space-time curvatures at the infinitesimal Planck scale. So he took four-dimensional space-time and reduced space from three dimensions to one, and to make these two-dimensional sheets so we can see on a slide or in a drawing. And at the top, you see a particle. It is represented by one curvature moving through time. And at the bottom, the same particle is in a different location. So it can oscillate back and forth in position, and it would actually be the space-time curvature that's oscillating back and forth. And superposition, he saw as separated space-time curvatures, so that the curvatures actually separated, and you see the same particle in two places on the right with its two space-time curvatures separated. So superposition of multiple possibilities, whether it's an atom or maybe Krishna, maybe separations in the fine scale structure of the universe. But as I said, we don't normally see such multiple possibilities. When measured, it seems we consciously observe only single particular possibilities. Why does the measurement cause quantum collapse of the wave function? This is the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. There's several interpretations of this. At the turn of the 20th century, Niels Bohr, von Neumann, Wigner Stapp, and more recently Chalmers and McQueen suggested consciousness causes quantum state subjective reduction, that consciousness collapses the wave function. So we see a conscious person on the right being it and observing the space-time, not that he or she could, but as an example, and causing one of the curvatures to cease to exist, and the other one continues. So this conscious observation has caused collapse of the wave function. This interpretation is known as the Copenhagen interpretation after Niels Bohr, his Danish origin. So if you hear the Copenhagen interpretation, that's what this means. Schrodinger thought this idea was absurd and introduced his famous thought experiment known as Schrodinger's cat, in which a cat in a box with a vial of poison, and outside the box was quantum superposition of a particle both going into the box and not going into the box. And if it went into the box, it released the poison. And Schrodinger pointed out that this meant that the cat would be both dead and alive until somebody opened the box and took a look. And now we see our conscious observer being upper right. But this puts consciousness outside science. It doesn't allow for any explanation for consciousness. And if you want a scientific explanation, this doesn't work. Next, please. Now, if separations were to continue without collapse, you get many worlds. The multiple world hypothesis, which is very, very popular among physicists. Next, please. In many worlds, superpositions are separations in reality. Each collapse, without collapse, no collapse, and each possibility branches off to form its own new universe. And therefore, there's an infinite number of parallel universes. And many people believe this. But this is untestable. We don't really know if there are other universes out there. Now, Roger Penrose took a different approach. He said that these superpositions, these separations in the fine-scale structure of the universe were unstable and with self-collapse undergo objective reduction, OR, at a time t equals h bar over e sub t. I'll explain what that is in a second. And that each such OR event would produce a moment of proto-conscious experience, being. So he attributed being to processes at the very basic level of the universe, the fine-scale structure of reality. Rather than consciousness causing collapse, he was saying collapse causes or is equivalent to consciousness. Being. So as I said, H is the Planck-Dirac constant, and E sub T is the gravitational self-energy of separation, an energy intrinsic to the fine-scale structure of the universe, the energy required to separate something from itself or to separate space-time. So these would be happening in microenvironments throughout the universe. So this is consistent with being everywhere, and us being awash in a sea of being, of consciousness. So these events would be proto-conscious mostly because they wouldn't have memory or context and would come and go. How could they be organized or orchestrated in the brain for full, rich, conscious experience? Metaphorically, they're like if you go to a symphony and the musicians are each tuning his or her instruments, and you hear noises and you hear all these different tones and notes. It's kind of annoying. It's not music. And then the music begins to play, and you have a beautiful symphony or whatever. So how does that happen in the brain? How could these OR events be orchestrated? Well, let me first back up and say that conscious perception involves three waves in the cortex from the thalamus. The first wave goes for vision to the back of the brain, the second wave to the front of the brain, and then a third wave, and it's the third wave that is conscious. Further inwards, there are also three waves within cortex. From the thalamus or other parts of the cortex, the green arrows go to layer 4. From layer 4, they go to 1, 2, 3, and 6. And from layers 1, 2, 3, and 6, they converge on pyramidal cells, giant red pyramid-shaped neurons, whose axons go down to the spinal cord, whose lateral basilar dendrites connect into a web over the whole cortex, and whose apical dendrites arise to the surface and give rise to the EEG. So if we look inside, further inward, looking at the pyramidal cells, these layer 5 giant pyramidal cells, they're filled with structures called microtubules. And also you see the twin barrels in the middle, those are centrioles, the central, kind of the brain of the cytoskeleton. But these microtubules are getting down into the scale where we might get into quantum effects. So here's a picture of a synapse on the left, and you see an axon coming in, and inside the dendrite, you see microtubules, and on the right, you see the microtubules are cylindrical polymers of a protein called tubulin, and each tubulin can be in at least two states, and information can process and self-organize within microtubules. So microtubules are more molecular scale computers, which are getting close to the quantum level. Looking further inward, we look at one tubulin, one of those peanut-shaped proteins, and we see it has 86 organic rings, these pi-electron resonance aromatic rings with quantum properties, tryptophans, tyrosine, and phenylalanines, as we see up top. And on the left, you see also the red spheres are where anesthesia acts to block consciousness. So these organic aromatic rings share 3 electrons among 6 carbons, forming high electron resonance clouds above and below, a cloud of delocalized electrons we see on the far right. And these support quantum effects. This is where quantum can come in, supporting electromagnetic dipole oscillations, excitons, charge transfers, phonons, fluorescence, so forth. And I think both light and consciousness derive from quantum effects in these aromatic organic rings that are almost all biomolecules. So if we look at one of them, which is basically benzene, which in bulk form is gasoline, but in individual rings, they are very interesting and attract each other. And the extra electrons in each repel the extra electrons in the other, and you get dipoles. So below you see two coupled rings in which the electrons, shown as the shaded gray area, are coupled like little bar magnets, and they oscillate back and forth in terahertz. And in Craddock et al. In 2017, we modeled this on a giant supercomputer, all the 86 rings in one tubulin, and we found that they radiated at 613 terahertz, which is the blue-green color. And it's interesting that Hindu deities are often portrayed as blue. So presumably we all have this inside, but only extra specially conscious people radiate visibly like that. So the oscillating rings can superpose, forming a quantum bit or a qubit. And on the right, you see that anesthesia molecules block these dipole oscillations, blocking consciousness. This is the essence of how anesthesia works. So anesthesia disperses these dipoles to block consciousness. So it could be that qualia, the basis for feelings and consciousness, relate to simple quantum state reductions among aromatic rings. These ring structures can exist in a sandwich, which is metastable, like a superposition, and then collapse to two possible states, the T-shape, which is stable, and the offset parallel, which is also stable. And it could be that qualia, such as pleasure on the right or displeasure on the left, could be related to the stable configurations of the aromatic rings inside proteins in the brain, particularly microtubules. There are molecules made of these rings called polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which are produced by stars and are found throughout the universe, including interstellar dust. Now, here's one particular complex polyaromatic hydrocarbon that was found in meteorites. And molecules like this are being analyzed from an asteroid, which material was scooped up and is coming back next year and will be analyzed for this type of effect. So there are these aromatic organic rings in interstellar dust in vast amounts. 20% of all the carbon in the universe is in this form, and there's significant terahertz radiation in the cosmic microwave background, which comes from these molecules in the interstellar dust. And it's generally ignored, but perhaps they're conveying information in some way or communicating amongst themselves or in some other way. So getting back to microtubules, on the left, we see the aromatic rings. And on the right, far right, we've simplified the 86 down to a few and see that we can have dipoles, coupled dipoles among the aromatic rings in one tubulin. And this gives rise to a helical pathway, a spiral pathway around the microtubule that could act as a quantum bit or a qubit, as in quantum computing, in the Orch OR theory that I developed with Roger Penrose. This is the basis of quantum computing that would terminate by Roger's objective reduction to give consciousness. Next, please. So here we see just one part of one microtubule going into superposition and eventually reaches the threshold for consciousness, shown as Bing. Excuse me. It would take many microtubules to do this for the kind of consciousness we have, 10 to the 15th. But there are 10 to the 20th tubulins in human brain. So about 10,000th or 100,000th of the brain for one conscious moment, occurring at about every 10 to the minus 7 seconds at 10 megahertz. So is there any evidence for this? Well, actually there's some. And here's an experiment that we just did, led by Orch OR at Princeton, and where he took a microtubule and excited it with UV light and was able to measure the propagation of an exciton along the microtubule. And then we added anesthesia, which is known to block consciousness, and the propagation of the electronic energy was inhibited by two different anesthetics, isoflurane and etomidate, which selectively block consciousness. Now, this paper has been accepted by a major journal. It's currently on the archive, and Orch OR actually is the son of P.K. OR, who is the head at DEI. that we had a conference with the other day. He did an excellent job here. So Penrose is on this, I'm on this, a number of other people came from Greg Scholes, an expert in quantum biology. Should be out in January in a real journal. Other evidence came from this man, Anirban Bandyopadhyay, at the National Institute of Material Sciences in Tsukuba, Japan. He used nanotechnology to study quantum resonance effects in microtubules. He and his group, over 10 years of work, found self-similar patterns called triplets of triplets, because there were 3 peaks, and each peak had 3 peaks of ballistic conductance repeating over 12 orders of magnitude in tubulin and microtubules. So this is a little complicated, but I'm going to take you through it. So we have 3 different scales. The top A is a couple of neurons, and you can recognize the neurons, and the solid bars are nanoprobes. And so if you use two electrodes to stimulate and 2 to record. So if you stimulate, say, DC, the microtubule is an insulator. There's no current flow. But if you stimulate with AC and sweep the frequency, you'll find specific frequencies where very high conductance occurs. And you plot the conductance and you get the triplet of triplets. So you did the level of neurons at the top, and then on one microtubule in B, connected between 2 with 10 electrodes, and then at the very bottom with just tubulins. And in all these cases, he got the same triplet of triplet patterns, ranging from the bottom in terahertz, gigahertz, and megahertz, and then in the middle range, gigahertz, megahertz, and kilohertz, and at the top, megahertz, kilohertz, and hertz, so all the way up to EEG. So this means there's some kind of scale invariant hierarchy going inward from the level of neurons. So here I've suggested an inward hierarchy inside neurons and microtubules. Now, many people, this is a fractal-like hierarchy with self-similar patterns, and many people have gone from the neuron upwards into neural networks and networks of networks. But you get maybe 2 orders of magnitude. But if you go inward, you get 12 orders of magnitude of self-repeating, self-similar patterns, starting from the left in hertz, and then going to kilohertz in a network of microtubules, and then megahertz, 1 million cycles per second in one microtubule, and then gigahertz, 1 billion cycles per second in the rows of tubulins. And then going in a tubulin that I showed before, you're down into terahertz, and then you go further inward and you get to petahertz. You get petahertz and even faster. And then finally, then this the last one's a big step all the way down to the Planck scale, according to Penrose. So that's a big step from 10 to the 18th to 10 to the 43rd, and it's all below the level of particles. You're just in pure space-time geometry without any biology. So consciousness, if this is true, exists in space-time geometry without any biology. So this is very much like the 5 kosha systems. I asked my friend Kuladri about what kind of hierarchical system in Vedanta, in Krishna consciousness, might explain this, and he came back with this answer of the 5 koshas, in which on the left, I have to read these. You see at the top, Anamaya, the physical sheath, and going downward, you see Pranamaya, the life force sheath, then Manomaya, the mental sheath, and going further down, Vijnanamaya, the wisdom sheath, and then finally, the smallest, Anandamaya, the bliss body. And then this all comes out from Brahman, or the ground of being. And on the right, I've made an analogy, a comparison to the hierarchy I just suggested, in which those particular levels can be shown as kilohertz, and then going megahertz, gigahertz, terahertz, and finally petahertz. And these may emanate from fundamental space-time geometry, shown here as twistor theory. So it could be, I suggest, that Brahman, the ground of being, is actually the fine-scale structure of the universe, and that this is basically an analogy and possibly an identity. Could be the same thing. So below the level Below the level of space-time, below the level of particles, space-time appears hierarchical or holographic, repeating at smaller and smaller scales until reaching the Planck scale at 10 to the minus 35 meters, where we get information. This has been known through various ways. So could consciousness exist independent of biology, as Orch OR events in space-time and geometry at smaller, Orch OR events in space-time geometry at smaller and smaller scales? Could this account for out-of-body experiences, afterlife, or even reincarnation? So here's a study of end-of-life brain activity when people use these brain monitors, which show EEG activity as the heart stops, and these are people from whom with the support has been withdrawal because there's no chance, and the family decides it's time to let them go. And as the heart stops and the blood stops flowing and there's no oxygen, the number in which 80 to 100 is meant to be conscious and is down near zero. And as the heart has stopped and there's no breathing, there's no blood flow, there's suddenly a burst of activity that lasts for several minutes that turns out to be gamma synchrony, 40 hertz EEG oscillations, known to be the best neural correlate of consciousness. So could it be that as you go down in scale and Orch OR occurs or something like it, there's a bing and going down and down, it gets even more intense the further down you go. Could consciousness persist? And this suggests consciousness can persist after death as microscopic gravitational waves. And gravitational waves, ripples in the fine scale structure of the universe, were detected a few years ago from a collision between two gigantic black holes billions of light years away. They produced a wave from this collision that propagated and reached Earth and was detected in an amazing experiment. This was detected by the LIGO, the Large Interferometry Gravitational Observatory, two of them, one in Louisiana and one in the state of Washington. And you have these two perpendicular arrays so that they catch the wave from whatever direction. And then in the center, in that building, they do interferometry, and they can detect movements in the actual fine scale structure of the universe. So here's some evidence, the results of that. And you can see on the left, the map of the United States, the two LIGOs are 2/3 of the way across the country. And on the right, you see the data. The red is from one of them and the blue is from the other. You see they match quite well. And please notice that at 40 hertz, which is the best neural correlate of consciousness, there's a huge spike from both laboratories right at 40 hertz. So it could be that 40 hertz is irrelevant to consciousness, partly because we're tuning in to vibrations in the fine scale structure of the universe. And these could be detected by structures called centrioles that I showed you before, which are the brain of the cytoskeleton in every cell. And they're perpendicular and they're made up of triplets of microtubules. And it's known that centrioles detect gravity. And it could be they're detecting gravitational waves. Okay, so this is a possible explanation for reincarnation. And here's a quote from Aldous Huxley that none but the very hasty will think will reject reincarnation. In the Bhagavad Gita and Vedic scriptures, consciousness or sentience is explained as a subatomic sentience. So conclusions: consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe. There's an inward hierarchy in quantum brain biology consistent with Indian knowledge, essentially the 5 koshas. Organic molecules with quantum properties are the key to life and consciousness found throughout biology in the universe. And quantum state reduction, collapse of the wave function, can occur at various levels of the brain hierarchy, possibly like Atman from Brahma. Next slide, the last slide. The more inward, the more intense, expansive, and quantum non-local the conscious experience is. At deeper inward levels, consciousness may exist in space-time geometry as microgravitational waves independent of biology, giving rise to afterlife and even reincarnation. There's actually a lot of fairly impressive evidence, or at least reports of reincarnation. And finally, as a practical application in a mental health aspect, therapies aimed at microtubule resonances. For example, with brain ultrasound, which is a painless, non-invasive way of putting megahertz into the brain to resonate microtubules, can be used to treat mental and cognitive disorders. We've been studying this and will continue to do so. Thank you very much for your attention.